our Fall Book Sandwiched In series. We'd like to thank our friends at the library, of course. They are the ones that fund this and make it possible for the wonderful coffee and cookies and all of those good things. I want to thank our committee. That's Christina, Richard, and Kathy. They do a wonderful job pulling this all together. I'll have a few more announcements at the end, but if you haven't entered for the door prize and would like to do so, today's prize is $10 to the coffee press. So be sure to enter for that if you're interested. We'll have Jason pull the winner at the end, and yeah, so Kathy is going to introduce Jason.
Okay, so I have the pleasure of introducing Jason Smith. He's the superintendent of Batavia City School District, and I've known Jason since he was a student growing up. Just a wonderful, wonderful man he is. A Batavian native, Jason is a 1990 graduate of Batavia High. His first job was a page here at the library. He received his BA in history from Geneseo and his master's in education and education administration from Brockport. Jason is a member and the general manager of the Batavia Concert Band and serves as faith formation director and catechist for Resurrection Parish here in Batavia. Jason and his wife Lori just celebrated their 25th anniversary on an Alaskan cruise. That seems to be the spot for this year's travel, is Alaska. They have 3 children, Megan, Matthew, and Madeline, and 2 dogs, Cooper and Carol. Jason enjoys running. We've all run into him probably as we circle around Batavia. Bird watching, movies, and the Buffalo Bills. Jason is passionate about history and is pleased to present this book as his 5th review for Book Sandwiched In. He's been doing that since 2013. So take it away, Jason.
Thank you. So I always enjoy doing these talks. It gets me back into my inner history teacher days. I thank Sam for picking the book this year. I had not heard of the book. It's up there, Guardians of the Valley by Dean King, an author I had not heard of, but I'll tell you more about him in a minute. And it obviously ties nicely into the theme of national parks. So the book is essentially about John Muir and his partner named Robert Johnson. And we'll talk more about John Muir and Robert Johnson and who they were. But if you know anything about John Muir, he was a fabulous writer. I'll show you some passages from him, and when I read the book, those passages really spoke. But there's also the book is also very well written. So as I was thinking back in my brain, there was a show I used to watch in the 2000s called The West Wing. Maybe some of you have heard of The West Wing. It's a fabulous show, and the writing on that show is fantastic. It's written, the show for the first 4 seasons was written by a screenwriter named Aaron Sorkin. So I found just a 1-minute part from that show, and what you'll see here, the person there, that's President Bartlett, played by Mark McSheen, and he's speaking to his Deputy Chief of Staff, Joshua Lyman, played by Bradley Whitford. And as you watch, it's only about a minute and a half. The dialogue that they engage in is about the national parks, right? And you'll see that President Bartlett calls himself a geek of the national parks. But the dialogue, the way Aaron Sorkin writes, it's just kind of spoke to me about how John Muir writes, and also you'll see how Dean King writes. It's kind of funny, and it's being set up. It's kind of late at night. The president is very enthused about the national parks, and you see his deputy chief of staff, Josh Lyman, is not. So we'll start with that.
It's getting late, sir. I was wondering, are we through for the evening? Oh, we're through with work, Josh. But this part's fun.
Which part, sir?
The part where I get you to sit down and teach you a little something.
Yeah. You're not tired, sir?
No.
Perhaps if you got into bed.
I'm a national park buff, Josh.
I didn't know that about you, sir. I'm certainly not surprised.
Why is that?
You're quite a nerd, Mr. President.
Really? Yes, sir. I assume that was said with all due respect.
Yes, sir.
Is it nerd-like to know that Everglades National Park is the largest remaining subtropical wilderness in the continental United States and has extensive mangrove forests?
Just a little bit, yes.
There are 54 national parks in this country, Josh.
Please tell me you haven't been to all of them.
I have been to all of them. I should show you my slide collection.
Oh, would you?
Grand Canyon, Bryce Canyon, Badlands, Capitol Reef, Acadia, which is so often overlooked.
You should certainly feel free to keep talking, but I need to go home so that I can be back in my office in 4 hours.
Dry Tortugas,
See, the thing is, I can't leave until you give me permission.
Petrified Forest, North Cascades, Joshua Tree, Shenandoah National Park, right here in Virginia. We should organize a staff field trip to Shenandoah. I can even act as the guide. What do you think?
Go to places I need to dump your body.
What was that?
Did I say that out loud?
So just great dialogue. It's obviously, it's a very funny show. And also the show just celebrated its 25th anniversary last week. They celebrated at the White House. So it's a great show to watch. There's like 7 or 8 seasons, and the first 4 were written by Aaron Sorkin. So the way Aaron Sorkin writes, he's written some movies too that I've seen. It's very, I would kind of say it's John Muir-like. You know, it's very sing-songy and very catchy. So I had 2 challenges reading this book, and they weren't about the book itself. Another series I watched several years ago was Ken Burns. You've seen Ken Burns stuff on PBS. He had a fabulous series, I think, in 2009 called The National Parks. And it was narrated by Peter Coyote. And as I'm reading this book, I had 2 pieces going through my head. One, I'm hoping that Peter Coyote is reading the book to me. It's not him, but I had his voice in my head. And the second piece, there's a beautiful theme song from the series called it's called Mallard Island. I'm just going to show you a couple seconds of this, just to kind of set the tone. It's a beautiful soundtrack. So as I'm reading this book, I have the music in the back of my head as I'm watching the series again, and I'm listening to Peter Coyote in my mind read the book to me. And I'll show you some Peter Coyote stuff in a minute. So you get the sense, right? It's a beautiful soundtrack. It's available on all the places you can find music. And it's called the Mallard Island Hymn. I'm not quite sure why it's called that. But again, as I'm reading the book, I have their song in my head the whole time, and I'm hearing Peter Coyote read the book to me. So the author is Dean King. There's his picture. I'm just going to show you his webpage here. Just to tell you about him. He writes basically narrative nonfiction. And here are all his books. Gardens of the Valleys, this one. The one I want to read next is called The Feud by the Hatfields and McCoys. The History Channel had both a documentary on this, no, they had a series on this topic, and then PBS had a documentary on it, and Dean King was one of the talking heads in it. So I plan on reading that book. The book that really sounds kind of cool that he's written is down here. I like shipwreck stories, and this one here, Skeletons on the Sahara, seems pretty neat too. So if you're looking for a narrative nonfiction, I know that's the, we had a suspense book this year for the not the Tale of Three Counties, Richmond Reads. So it's kind of along those lines, except he's all nonfiction. So that's just a bit about him. So the premise of the book essentially is this, and this is right from the story from the book. One of the challenges when I read the review, the New York Times did a book review on this, and one of the challenges that they thought that Dean King would have was to have his writing match the writing of John Muir. It's also about Robert Johnson too. We'll talk about him in a minute. But essentially the premise is John Muir's on the left, this scrappy looking guy, and Robert Johnson, the newspaper editor from the East Coast, is on the right. And essentially that's what the story is about. It's a story of these two men who become friends, and they join in a partnership to save Yosemite out in California. And it's really presented as an unlikely pairing. Later on I'm going to recommend a book of a similar vein where we have two historical figures from the modern era who partnered together as well. But that's Robert Johnson there on the right. And Dean King describes their differences as major. He says John Muir was a free spirit dedicated to nature, while Johnson was more focused on the practical aspects of managing and making money. But they had major differences, but they partnered together to fight and save Yosemite. And then I'm just going to read you a couple of quotes from the book that Dean King mentions. And he does really call it an unlikely pairing. So he talks about the first time they met. When Muir arrived at Johnson's invitation at the ornate reception desk of the Palace Hotel on Market Street, San Francisco's wide main artery in the financial district, he was told that Johnson was dressing for dinner and had suggested Muir come up to his room. Muir was soon lost in the sprawling palace, which was the largest, most ostentatious hotel on the West Coast, and even had an intercom system. So this was all new to John Muir, who spent time outdoors. Johnson had been expecting Muir for some minutes now, and I was about to call down and inquire about him when he heard his name shouted in the hallway. "Mr. Muir, this way." A wiry, weathered man of upper medium height with a shaggy light brown beard, just as he's shown there, soon beginning to get gray, soon arrived and fixed him with intense gray eyes. This is John Muir talking. And when John Muir spoke, he had a Scottish accent. I can't do a Scottish accent. "I can't find my way in these confounded city canyons," he said, with a touch of his native Scottish accent and a mischievous gleam in his eye. "There's nothing here to tell you where to go." Now he talks about his time in the mountains. "Now, if you were up in the Sierra, every tree and mound and scratch on the cliff would give you instructions. Everything there is as a plain signpost, but here, how is one to know?" So you can see that John Muir was meeting him in this fantasy hotel, and John Muir felt more comfortable outside where he felt the canyons could give him better instructions than the map. There's one more. Yeah. Johnson and Muir were in some ways an unlikely pairing, and in some ways not. Johnson was a proper and precocious editor and East Coast urbanite. His hero was his father, who he also had a close relationship with. Trees of which he frequently pointed out to Johnson were one of his passions, and another was all things Scottish. So they had some vast differences there between Johnson and, Robert Johnson and John Muir himself. But they, as you'll see, had a fantastic partnership. So I'm just going to, these are some of the quotes that Dean King used as to how John Muir writes, and I've kind of broken it down into categories for you. On Yosemite, he says, "All of one set of golden and purple bloom, so deep and dense that in walking through it, you will press more than 100 flowers at every step." And he talks about on the Sierra sequoias, "As far as man is concerned, they are the same as yesterday, today, and forever emblems of permanence." And then also John Muir was also a spiritual man too. He really thought God was in nature all the time. "It is impossible to overestimate the value of wild mountains and mountain temples. They are the greatest of our natural resources, God's best gifts." And then, just to go back, Dean King also has some good quotes of his own. Just kind of go back and forth with him and John Muir. So this is what Dean King, the pieces I pulled from there, he talks about John Muir's legacy, and then the third one on Robert Johnson, and then on Muir and Johnson themselves. I'll just pick one to read. You can read the rest. I'll read the last one. Muir and Johnson. Johnson's incisive journalism and Muir's passionate naturalism created a powerful synergy. While Johnson articulated the urgency of protecting the valley through the written word, Muir's eloquent descriptions of the natural world painted a vivid picture that resonated with the public. So essentially, one was not going to be successful without the other. John Muir was out there, he was in the woods, he was writing these beautiful passages that I just shared there, right? And then he had a partner with Robert Johnson to make them come alive. And Robert Johnson was a newspaper editor of a magazine called The Century. And then Robert Johnson, this is really, of all the things that pieces that Robert Johnson wrote, this really, I think, speaks to the powerful tie between Robert Johnson and John Muir, right here. He says to John Muir, very casually almost like, why don't you start an association for preserving California's monument and natural wonders, or at least Yosemite? It would be a good influence if you guarded carefully the membership. You'd have to face obloquy, but you are the one to do it, and decent people would help. That eventually becomes known as the Sierra Club. Right? So that was Johnson Muir, that was Johnson Wake, just kind of saying, hey, maybe you should try this. And it's still around today. And then I wanted just to do a natural tie in here to something nearby to us, Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls is mentioned 4 times in the book, but the one that I found the best was it served as an inspiration to Robert Johnson, the East Coast editor. So Robert Johnson visits Niagara Falls, and this is really what kind of wakens him up to the importance of saving nature. On May 10th, he arrived in Manhattan for the first time. This is Robert Johnson. But he had already experienced another first that day that would have a profound influence on his life. On the ride from Chicago, he had asked a porter to wake him at dawn when the man would be passing Niagara Falls. What he saw in the early morning light, the vast tumult of water and billowing mist, took his breath away. Despite having spent much of his youth outdoors, he reckoned it was the first great natural scenery he had ever seen. In this moment, a passion for America's sublime nature and natural beauty was born. So that's Robert Johnson, first seeing Niagara Falls for the first time. And we, of course, take it for granted because we've been there countless times. But Robert Johnson, back at that time, saw it as an inspiration for him to get a hold of John Muir and start this project. So the book itself is divided into 4 parts. I kind of walk you through the highlights of each part. The first part is it goes through John Muir, his life, who he was, who he married, where he lived. But there's a key moment in that part. He first encounters California. He does go to Alaska. In the book, he doesn't talk about Alaska that much. But he does go, he does spend time in Alaska. He's also influenced by a writer named Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a transcendentalist. That's a whole separate topic. But one of the things that John Muir really saw was this beautiful valley called Hetch Hetchy. And it kind of has a sad ending. But he kind of foreshadows what's going to happen to Hetch Hetchy. This is John Muir writing in part 1. It is impossible to overestimate the value of wild mountains and mountain temples. They are the greatest of natural resources. And I was talking about us, men. These temple destroyers, devotees of ravaging commercialism, seem to have perfect contempt for nature. And instead of lifting their eyes to the mountains, listen to the dams and towns of skyscrapers. Damn Hetch Hetchy. We're going to come back to Hetch Hetchy in a second. But this is how John Muir first experiences the West. And then in part 2, things really kind of kick up. He really decides to make an effort to create the area of Yosemite as a national park. This is when his friendship with Robert Johnson begins. As I said, Johnson was their editor for Century magazine. This was also when Johnson encouraged him to form the Sierra Club. And Dean King writes in the book, an environmental organization could have no greater figure at its helm. This picture here at the bottom is one of the famous sequoias in the valley there. And what's happening here, John Muir is coming across this beautiful land that is being destroyed by loggers and folks that also with their expansion of the railroads and timber interests. So John Muir, I'm just going to show you some of his observations, what he says about his time there. So this is not a, this is John Muir upset. Here, Muir discovered the situation was dire. At first sight, it was seen that these mighty granite temples could be injured, but by little bit anything that man may do. But man was superior at nothing, if not the destruction of everything. Everything that would seem beyond his scale. At the new Kings River mills, he saw that not only were the massive old pines and firs being ruthlessly timbered, but the giant sequoias, pictured there, were targeted in particular. On his previous visit, 5 mills were cutting big tree lumber on or near the sequoia belt. Now he found twice as many mills in the area with much more than double the area. So he was really getting concerned what's going to happen to his beautiful Yosemite. So, anybody know who this is?
Benjamin Harrison.
Sorry?
Benjamin Harrison.
Very good. I think anybody would know. So if you know anything about U.S. history, the presidents after the Civil War, up until about William McKinley, are not that well known. Right? So I kind of feel bad for Benjamin Harrison. Right? And of course, the big environmental president we all know is Theodore Roosevelt. But Benjamin Harrison actually is the one that created Yosemite National Park. TR had a role in it later on. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this is what Dean King says about what Benjamin Harrison does. He's also the only president from Indiana. So I went and found something from the Great Plains Port of it, right? And of course, they were very defensive of their hero, Benjamin Harrison. He created 3 national parks, and he was the first to have a national park to protect the giant sequoia trees. So it was Benjamin Harrison in 1890 that made the national park. He gets a small little part in the book, but usually it's Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot were the more well-known guys, but I thought Benjamin Harrison was not somebody that would be easily recognizable, so thank you for knowing them. I'm impressed. Are you a history major by any chance? Or?
I am.
Oh. This was not a setup, I promise. I was hoping nobody would know, so I could kind of tease it. So, also in this chapter, TR's history language for Theodore Roosevelt. There's another tie-in here. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt becomes president when William McKinley is assassinated right here in Buffalo. So we have the Niagara Falls tie-in, and then John Muir comes across Theodore Roosevelt. So they go camping for 3 days in the Sequoia. I'm going to show you a little video clip here. So John Muir talks about camping with the president was a remarkable experience. I fairly fell in love with him. And then Dean King, but John Muir wanted one more thing than anything else right now. The recession of the Yosemite grant to make that special place whole. So what that means, in 1890, Benjamin Harrison created the national park. There was still a part of that still belonged to the state of California, and John Muir and his friends wanted that moved over to the national park. So he advocated for that, and on the 3rd day, when TR and John Muir went camping, that's when he made a strong plea to have that part of the park, which actually was established, I don't know, it was established by Abraham Lincoln. And when Lincoln was president, he established, it was called the Yosemite Land Grant. So again, I didn't know that until I read the book, but it was Lincoln that first had his eyes on that. So then, just read to you one description of this. So Roosevelt comes into town and meets John Muir. And this is, I'm going to start reading here. The train arrived at Raymond at 7:30 a.m. Once the frontier outpost, known as a Wildcat Station, the town, where Yosemite tourists and suppliers for Madeira sugar pine lumbers were the most frequent offloads, had an impressive turntable for rotating the locomotives for its return trip. The town was decked out in its bunting and bunting and flags, and already a bustling crowd of more than 1,000 people. Muir now got a taste of what it was like to be President Roosevelt. As the band blared away, the excited spectators cheered. Then the president, eager for the wilderness and wearing a Norfolk jacket, and a wide-brimmed hat addressed the crowd from the platform that had been built in front of the store. So this now, I mentioned Ken Burns. I'm going to show you just a little section from his documentary series, When John Muir and T.R. Meet. And I think it's narrated by Peter Coyote, who I mentioned before. So I'm just going to show you that. It gives you a sense of what the atmosphere was like when Muir and Theodore Roosevelt met. Is it here?
Yeah.
Yes, I'll show it here. So I'm going to start about like 4 minutes in. It sets up with what I just read, and then I'll walk you through some of it.
This group paused, as all tourists did, for a snapshot of the famous Ohlone tunnel. And later, they posed for an official photograph, lined up along the base of the Grizzly Giant, the oldest and most famous sequoia in Yosemite, estimated to be 2,700 years old and boasting a single branch that was 6.5 feet in diameter. Then the troops, the phalanx of reporters and photographers, and virtually all of the official party headed back to the Wawona Hotel, where a series of receptions and a grand dinner were scheduled in the president's honor that evening. None of them knew that Roosevelt had no intention of attending. Instead, he remained behind with only John Muir and a few park employees who started preparing a camp at the base of one of the sequoias, part of a secret plan Roosevelt had hatched to allow him time alone with the trees and the man who considered them sacred. They built a fire and sat around it, eating a simple supper, talking as twilight enveloped them, getting to know one another in the glow of the blaze.
The night was clear, and in the darkening aisles of the great sequoia grove, the majestic trunks, beautiful in color and symmetry, rose round us like the pillars of a mightier cathedral than ever was conceived, even by the fervor of the Middle Ages. Hermit thrushes sang beautifully in the evening.
And Muir said, I fell in love with this Theodore Roosevelt. He actually used those words. You can't resist this man. I fell in love with him. Roosevelt, interestingly enough, came back and complained a little bit about Muir and said he doesn't know his bird songs. Roosevelt's an ornithologist. He knows everything there is to know about birds. But Muir also got one off on Roosevelt. He said to him, Mr. President, when are you going to get over this infantile need you have to kill animals? Roosevelt would not have taken that from any other human being.
I had a perfectly glorious time with the President and the mountains. I never before had a more interesting, hearty, and manly companion. I stuffed him pretty well regarding the timber thieves and other spoilers of the forest.
Long after sundown, with no tent and only a pile of army blankets, the two men finally went to sleep. The next morning at 6:30, they saddled up for the long...
So that's, I would recommend you, if you haven't watched this already, it's available, I think, on Netflix. It's a great series. Anybody here seen it? So, yeah, it's fantastic. So, the person that made a joke about John Muir not knowing his bird songs, that's a historian I follow. His name is Clay Jenkinson. And he has a great website and a podcast called Listening to America. He used to have a show called the Thomas Jefferson Hour. He has now since moved on from that. But it's a great podcast, great website. I've been listening to him since 2009. And he's really a Theodore Roosevelt expert, too. So he made a joke about John Muir not knowing his bird songs. He does, right? That's right, what John Muir says about the birds of Yosemite. And I was kind of excited about this. My friend Don asked me if I had any pictures of birds in there. So I've highlighted, he mentioned he was excited to see the black-headed grosbeak. And as Kathy said, I like to watch birds, so I couldn't help myself. There's some birds there's the same black-headed grosbeak that I took a couple years ago. And I even have a little video in there of him feeding. So channeling my inner John Muir here. but that's a black-headed grosbeak that John Muir writes about there. So John Muir's excited to see all the birds there in Yosemite. And then the next part, part 3, is called the water stealers. And in 1906, there was a famous earthquake in San Francisco. That created lots of issues. And what they saw as a result of that, there was not enough water to fight the fires that came from the earthquake. So it generated this battle, essentially, to how will they create the water, how will they have water if an event like this were to happen again. And John Muir talks about Hetch Hetchy, and that eventually becomes dam, which John Muir and his friends fought against. So this part 3 is really about how the water stealers, this battle, between the environmentalists and San Francisco. Are they going to have the dam or not? They're to dam Hetch Hetchy and give San Francisco a place to draw water from in the event of another fire. It's no spoiler they lose. Right, there's a dam there. I'll show you that in a minute. But that's essentially the 3rd chapter, or the 3rd part. And then the 4th part is called the California Water War. It's all about conflict. It's really what I call an inside baseball look. It's a lot of detail, a lot of politics and maneuvering as to how this happened. Robert Johnson testifies at the hearing. Dean King asked his readers this: if John Muir had testified, would that have changed things? Right? Just hang on to that thought just for a second. But there was no testimony from the Sierra Club to save Hetch Hetchy. And then the New York Times in 1913, this I found on my own, saw the issue with that. Any city that would surrender a city park for commercial purposes would be sat down as going backward in 1913. So far as we are aware, such a case is unknown. Any state legislature that would surrender a state park would set a dangerous and deplorable example. So just way ahead of it. The Times was way ahead of themselves at that time. So John Muir did not testify. Robert Johnson did, and he did invoke him a little bit. I'll just read one section of that. I'm not sure why John Muir didn't testify, but this is what Johnson has said he had invoked John Muir. We call him the grand old man of California. He is known to you, no doubt, as the discoverer of the great Muir Glacier, which bears his name, and as one man who has been the explorer and describer of the great and magnificent scenery of Yosemite National Park. He knows every foot of it, and no one is entitled even to come into the field of rivalry with Mr. Muir on a question of the natural beauties of California. In that respect, Johnson says, I believe him to be the first citizen of California, and the time will come when he is dead and gone, when California will build him a great monument. Meantime, nature has built him a great monument in the Muir Glacier. So Johnson does testify. There's some lots of politics that happen there, but ultimately they lose. John Muir was very sad about that. And Hetch Hetchy is in fact dammed due to the need to have water there. So in 1913, Congress passed the Raker Act, authorizing the construction of a dam in the Hetch Hetchy Valley, as well as a second dam in Lake Elmore. So the whole thing was done in 1938. The dam is 430 feet, and it holds 117 gallons of drinking water now. So John Muir lost that battle, but in 1955, there was a film made that Dean King writes about right at the end of the book. It's called The Two Yosemites, and you can find it on YouTube, but it essentially is very critical of that decision to not do that. As late as 1980, the Sierra Club never gave up its fight to reclaim Hetch Hetchy. First, in 1955, it released the film Two Yosemites, narrated by Club Executive Director David Brower, that's him there, contrasting the ugliness of the Hetch Hetchy Valley, or the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, with Yosemite Valley. Now, this is interesting if you follow politics. The Reagan administration, who was a Republican, planned, the Reagan administration backed a plan to drain the reservoir in the 1980s, but was thwarted by California Representative by California representatives in Congress. San Francisco mayor and later California senator Dianne Feinstein, who was a Democrat, said, all this is for an expanded campground. Dumb. It's dumb, dumb, dumb. That's Dianne Feinstein, a Democrat. Usually it's Democrats that want to have these things saved. I'll just show you one little section of this, of the film.
Good for the greatest number, teaming San Francisco against the few people who had yet visited Yosemite. Not one of the city's claims has proved valid. But 40 years ago, San Francisco won. This once beautiful valley, part of a national park, was flooded. We took these pictures May 13th, 1955. The reservoir was down 180 feet, but 60 feet higher than it had been May 1st. In June, it would probably fill, then start right back down again. For it is a fluctuating reservoir, as most power and storage reservoirs must be.
So I get the sense that if you can find that on YouTube. It was filmed in 1955, and they really go through and show what Hetch Hetchet looks like now. And they had grand vision that the dam would be covered with ivy and grass, and none of that ever happened. So 1955, they kind of took issue with that. So I contacted Dean King, the author, and I interviewed him. So I'll show you his 5-minute interview. I contacted him last week. He was very open to that. He signed my book, and I'll show you. I asked him 4 quick questions, and I'll show you that interview, and then I'll take your questions. Well, hi, Dean. Welcome to Book Sandwich Inn. We're excited to have you, and we have a nice audience here. Looking forward to hearing your comments. So, welcome to the Listener Library.
Thanks, Jason. Great to be here.
So, I finished your book, and I'm having a conversation here with some library friends. One of the things that caught my attention at the end of the book, you acknowledge a story about your mother-in-law, how you went to Library and went to Yosemite Park. And I love your description of the June afternoon story about the snow. If you could maybe expand on that for our audience here, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it was kind of a magical moment. My mother-in-law had put in to get a cabin in Yosemite for her husband's, my father-in-law's 70th birthday, and happened to get picked. So she gathered all their children, and I'm married into the family, and grandkids. And my wife and I have 4 daughters. They were young girls at the time, and so we're.
Have you ever downloaded something over here?
Yeah, the media player down at the bottom.
Here?
Bottom right, yeah.
Welcome to Book Sandwich Inn. We're excited to have you. The June afternoon story.
For her husband's, my father-in-law's 70th birthday, and happened to get picked. So she gathered all their children, and I'm married into the family, and grandkids. And my wife and I have 4 daughters. They were young girls at the time, and so we're from the East Coast. We're from Richmond. We're used to the Appalachians. They're not as big as the West Coast mountains, and we were wearing shorts and sandals and ready for used to the heat, ready for a summer day. And lo and behold, it snowed that day. So it was kind of a magical moment. And then pretty soon we went to what's now called Tunnel View, but was Inspiration Point, and I took in that just amazing view of Yosemite Valley, and instantly knew that my perception of America from the East Coast, from Richmond, where the Appalachians, not as big as so it was a great moment, and mountains, and we were wearing shorts and sandals and ready for used to the heat, ready for a summer day. And after it took, you know, more than a decade for
Yeah,
the
just
book to
click
come
on
about.
the
but
video
that's the
picture
way
down at the bottom
things have-
left. Oh, there
Well, hi,
you
Dave. Welcome to the
You know, the alley.
Very good. So one of the questions you had asked your reader rhetorically, which I loved on page 296, had John Muir, had he testified in the famous water and gas debate in San Francisco, would the outcome have been different? You can answer that, but you call us to think on that. If you had to answer, what would you say, and how much weight do you think John Muir would have had in that conversation, in that debate?
Well, it's you know, a great mystery and will remain that way, but I do think he was a very influential guy. And if you read, you know, when he took Robert Underwood Johnson, his editor at Century Magazine, out to Yosemite, took him up into Tuolumne Meadows and introduced him to that and talked to him about it. And then he, you know, takes President Theodore Roosevelt out to the mountains and camps with him and talks to him. He's a very, very persuasive guy. I think he had a great personality, great sense of humor, incredibly intelligent. And so I think, you know, in the halls of Congress, if he had been there, it would have been very stirring, very moving. And back then, I think, at least, maybe it's a little bit easier to move people and get individuals to make, you know, decisions like that. So I think there would have been a chance that he could have had a powerful impact on
It could be a whole book like, you know, revisionist history, had John Muir testified, what would have happened, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also, you know, Emerson came out there and tried to get him to come to Harvard to teach. And Muir, you know, it's sort of gut-wrenching for Muir because he loved Emerson, but ultimately said, no, you know, the reason why Emerson loves me and respects me so much is because I'm here living in the mountains in nature the way he loved to do.
Right.
And if I go east, I'm not me anymore. So, you know.
He had his core values, I saw. He wasn't going to veer from his values.
Right, he's very true to himself.
So one of the pieces I like, you know, I'm a history person, history major, and I talk about the Muir-Johnson partnership, how it's kind of like an odd friendship, but very successful. I'm going to recommend to my audience here that read a book on Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. It's another odd partnership that was very successful. Can you think of a partnership either from modern times that might be like John Muir and Johnson, from like an odd couple that did great things as a pair and together?
Well, I mean, I think this union is really distinct and extraordinary. I mean, these guys knew each other for over 4 decades and have an incredible correspondence that I drew from to write this book. And I really can't think of any other pairing of a philosopher, writer, and an editor. And this moved me too as a writer. I was like, I've never seen anything like this. You know, where they create a national park, they create the Sierra Club, they, you know, help inspire the national forest and make that happen. They inspire the greatest environmental politician, Theodore Roosevelt, that we've had. And they did so much, I don't see any real parallel to that.
If you think that's a great answer. So I just went to Alaska this past summer, and we have a chapter called the Yosemite Alaska Tie, or the Yosemite Alaska Connection. So just how did that impact John Muir spending time in Alaska, and how it impacted his work in Yosemite?
One of the things I did when I read the book was John Muir had a sprawling life, and Lindy Marsh Wolf wrote an award-winning biography back in the 40s, and I read that early on, and I was like, well, he did so much, you know, that it almost gets confusing. He's, you know, such a major figure, and what I needed to do was really find that narrative arc that was about what Muir was great. And so, in fact, when you read my book, you don't get as much of the Alaska material as you might in a biography, because I'm really focused on what he did in the national parks in Yosemite and, you know, what made him great and why we should remember him. But the Alaska was a huge part of his life. He loved Alaska. He loved glaciers. He loved native cultures, and he was very respected in Alaska by the natives there. And so I think all this glacial theory that he found in Yosemite and that he could then explore up north was important to him. Also, he went on a scientific expedition that gave him connections that would be very important in his political battles that he would then fight.
Yeah. Good. That's a thoughtful answer. It's not something that I usually think of, how Alaska ties into Yosemite, but it is a neat tie. So I love John Muir's writing. One of the book reviews I read from the New York Times said your challenge was going to be in your writing match with John Muir wrote, which I think you met that challenge, by the way. But is there a favorite story or a favorite quote or story of John Muir that you want to share with our audience?
There are a lot of great stories, and I was sort of cherry picking those stories. His young life was such an adventure. But in 1869, when he comes out to California for the first time, he walks all the way from Oakland to Yosemite Valley and falls in love with it, decides to stay and works as a shepherd. And his first approach to the valley from above, he has just, he's been with the shepherds and taking care of a flock, and they've had to push them across a river, and there's, very sort of trying time. And he's off with Carla, the St. Bernard that's been entrusted to him, and he's looking along the rim of Yosemite Valley, of the canyon from above, and seeing this extraordinary beauty and really wanting to get a view directly down into the canyon. And Muir lacked the fear gene. He was incredible. He would climb vertical cliffs. He would do amazing things. And so he works his way right down to the edge of Yosemite Creek. And to me, the moment that he describes there moved me so much, because he sees the creek coming to the edge of this half-mile plunge into the valley. He's looking into the sunlight refracted through the beads of water that are churned up there, and seeing a rainbow in it. And he's seeing the death of the creek, but he's also seeing rebirth and new life down below. All set in this extraordinary landscape that he's seeing. And it's just mystical and magical, and speaks to his deep love of the valley, his deep faith also that would sustain him through environmental battles. And so for me, that's the moment also where after coming to the ledge, it's sort of a harrowing, hair-raising scene. He then goes back that night and has vivid dreams of him falling into the valley with the crumbling mountain. And then a couple of days later, he writes in his journal, that all things are connected. A line that will become this famous line that he'll repeat in various iterations throughout his literary career. So that magic moment of him first discovering Yosemite Valley from above, really sticks with me.
That's a great story. So last question, I gave you a chance to do a shameless advertisement here. Are there any books you want to recommend or that you have upcoming that our readers may be interested in? You want?
Well, I've focused on history and adventure throughout my career. Skeletons on the Sahara was my first book about a true story of a shipwreck on the west coast of Africa in 1815. And so you get a great dose of nature there. And then I did a book about the Hatfields and McCoys and the Appalachian Mountains. So mountain culture, nature, history, adventure, things that I really love. Kevin Fedarko's recent book, Walk in the Park, is fantastic. Hampton Sides' book about Cook's explorations, also fantastic. So there's a lot of wonderful nonfiction writing going on right now that combines history, natural science, adventure that I find very exciting.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you so much for being part of this. I think this is the first time we've had an author participate in this. We had these series in the fall and the spring. And Dino, I thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you, Jason.
So, I did ask some.
Different tab.
Am I in the wrong?
Yeah.
He just signed my book, and he just mentioned here for Jason Smith. Thank you so much for reviewing Gardens of the Valley for Book Sandwich Inn. So Book Sandwich Inn got a little mention in here, so that's kind of cool. And lastly, I mentioned some books. The one I read a couple years ago was about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. who was the Democratic Speaker of the House. They got along famously. They did not agree on the politics, but they did work as a team to get things done. The book at the bottom called First Friends. I have not read that book yet, but I'm going to. It's about presidential friendships. The largest book on this topic is by a historian named Douglas Brinkley. He's well known. Wrote a huge book, about 900 pages on Theodore Roosevelt and his role as the environmental president. The top right there, The American Buffalo, is another great Ken Burns series he did this past fall. The American Buffalo, and then of course the National Park series, which I just loved. It's great to watch as well. So 3 books there to recommend that tie into this, and then those 2 Ken Burns series. And then lastly, just some final thoughts. I thought that Dean King captured his writing in context. The alliance between John Muir and Robert Johnson and John Muir was very strong. And the battle for Hetch Hetchy really is kind of sad. Lots of details and maneuvering in that. Then I'll end with Johnson and King. What Johnson says, after the destruction of the Hetch Hetchy Valley, California and the government owe him penance at his tomb. And there's his tomb there, John Muir's tomb in California. And then Dean King writes that in all probability, given his unwavering faith and optimism, he died still firm in his belief that one day Hetch Hetchy would be set free again and everything would turn out for the best. And they tried in 1980, as I said, with Ronald Reagan and Dianne Feinstein. And then in 1955, again, the Sierra Club tried to lobby for some change as well. So that's a book I enjoyed. I'm happy to take any questions in the time that we have left.
All right.
Yeah.
Jason, so you interviewed him on Zoom, I assume?